Welcome to the Online Business Launchpad podcast. I'm your host, Trudy Rankin. And a while ago now, it was a few months ago now, a guy named Mark Butler did a really short session with some of the SPI Pro members, including myself. And as I listened to what he had to say, I just mentally added him to my list of people that I wanted to have on this podcast. And because he was talking about things that were really relevant at the time, it was in the middle of COVID or coming towards the end of COVID a little bit, talking about mental health and mindset, and a little bit around sustainable high performance in relation to us really overwhelmed, super busy solopreneurs or small business owners. And I thought, I'd love to have him on my podcast. And just recently, we managed to connect the dots. And today, I have Mark Butler here with me, and we're going to talk a little bit, about his journey to get where he is, but he's going to talk a little bit about life post that conversation that we had where we were talking about burnout, and he's moved beyond that. And as soon as we jumped on the call, one of the things I noticed is he's got this really interesting book sitting behind him. And I'll let him tell you a little bit about it, but the title caught my eye. Yeah. And I think you're going to be interested to hear what he has to say. So Mark, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and welcome.
Trudy, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm loving getting the opportunity to chat with you again. Thank you.
It's really nice to see you again. And just for the sake of the listeners, do you want to just talk a little bit about who you are, where you've come from, and what do you do to help people?
I'm a mental health expert and a strategist. So I work with organizations in developing the strategies that they are taking on to manage mental well-being in the workplace and psychological health and safety. I have a corporate background of about 25 years working for global organizations as well as small to medium enterprises. In that time, I've developed a sort of clinical practice. I ran the two side by side. I was very lucky to be able to do that. But I've now got about 14, 15 years clinical experience working as a psychotherapist and a clinical director with really fascinating populations overcoming the mental health challenges. I'm talking about working with high performance, high pressure teams like first responders and veterans with post-traumatic stress and substance use, etc. And that's been my clinical background. And I'm blessed to be able to blend the two together. And as you alluded to, Trudy, during COVID lockdowns, etc., I seem to gravitate towards the burnout conversation and spent a considerable amount of time working with people in that space. It was unprecedented what we faced and what we had to deal with and work around and work through. And it had an effect. It had a toll on us. We talk about the shadow pandemic now, which is that sort of the whole idea about what are the ramifications for mental health and well-being, everything from children all the way through to adults and the effects of that. But I'm also finding myself now, interestingly, just in recent sort of weeks, I've been delivering at conferences, still talking about burnout. And here in Australia, we talk about the new psychosocial hazards legislation that's come in to deal with and manage the mental health challenges in the workplace. That's massive legal changes. There's a new sheriff in town, and the old ways of doing things just don't fly anymore. We have to be in the prevention space, and we have to tackle this stuff head on. Don't wait for it to occur again. But interestingly, with that conversation has come full circle back to what I used to do pre-COVID, and that's as a sort of a team performance coach for high-pressure environments, teams, high-performing teams that work in that high-pressure environment, and what we need to do to support each other and the team through all of that. So that's my background. I spent as a clinical director developing treatment models and programs for those sorts of populations, and I can take that sort of experience and knowledge and bring it into the workplace so that we can sorts of programs and structure that delivers sort of psychological safety and well-being for people.
I think that's fascinating because, and I'll just explain, you're talking about working with high pressure situations and things like that. And a lot of people might not know this, but my husband works in the healthcare system, and he has a bird's eye view of what it's like looking in hospitals and seeing the impact of COVID on nurses and the flow-on impact that's had, you called it the shadow epidemic, on how they're now wanting to work and live their lives so that they can cope with either that stressful situation that they had to live through, or the baby, they just don't want to ever have to go through it again. But it has had a very significant flow-on impact on the ability to fill the number of positions that are there in a hospital to look after patients and things like that. And
Yeah.
it's really interesting.
There's a real challenge with that, and the sort of risk and protective factors I think that the health sector experience can be quite different to other sort of sectors and other industries, if you like. Nobody gets into nursing for the money, let's face it. And therefore, it's a sort of a vocation, a passion, a desire to just do more for your community, etc. The sort of extra challenge that I've found people in the health sector have is that, first of all, it's how they identify it, who they are. They've spent pretty much all of their adult lives training to be the best version of that they can be. Whereas the rest of us in finance or technology or something like that could just go, this is too much, this is no longer serving me, I'm out, I'm going to do something else. People in the health sector tend to kind of think, if I quit, who's going to fill my shoes? So if not me, who? And that sort of tends to keep them there even longer. Coupled with the challenge of, I'm in the health business, I can't be seen to be succumbing to burnout and overwhelm, because I'm supposed to be acutely aware of what I need to do to safeguard and protect myself. So I find that not only is it sort of something it's very hard to walk away from, the self-critic gives ourselves such a hard time that we often don't reach out for help until it's, I'll never say too late. Gordon Parker, in his book on beating burnout with his colleagues at the University of New South Wales, has a great metaphor. They talk about a candle flickering.
Can I just stop you for a sec? Can you start over again when you introduced the guy and his book, name of his book, because it cut out just then?
I'm reminded of a fabulous book that's out on the market now by Gordon Parker, a professor at the University of New South Wales, and Gabrielle Travers from memory. And there was a third person, I'm afraid I can't remember their names. But it's a beautiful book, Beating Burnout, Gordon Parker, you'll find it. But they use a brilliant metaphor in that book about a flickering candle versus a candle that's blown out. And so when I say that people in the health sector often leave it until it's too late, maybe the candle has burnt out, because how you deal with a flickering candle is you protect it from the wind. The burnt out candle needs to be restarted and relit again. That idea, if we don't tackle it early enough, makes for a much harder job, which kind of segues into the new legislation now and the requirements of businesses and people to do that. But the health sector, I think specifically, has that, if not me, who restrained themselves, I'm afraid. And your partner would see that, I'm sure.
It's just really interesting. It's got some long-term implications, I think.
For society, for staffing levels, for support, for doing the work that we need to be able to do, I think we've a long road now to repair that.
So coming full circle back to small business owners, entrepreneurs, and people who we might not be first responders, although it probably feels like we're the first responders for our business all the time.
We absolutely are. We're the first ones to see it.
So just coming back to that, do you want to just talk a little bit about, you said the conversations are starting to change, burnout. What are those conversations starting to change to?
To sustainable performance. So I think, and again, I'll tap into the new legislation just for a little bit of context here. So this new psychosocial hazards legislation decrees that we need to be in the prevention space. So we need to get in front of these challenges before they overwhelm us. And so the sort of B-suite, middle management, the people who work every day with teams in an organization, it falls on them a little bit to manage this. Sidney Yoshida's iceberg of ignorance, I don't know if you know that model or not, but basically it's an iceberg and it's mostly underwater, and it's usually used in the contents of risk, but it works in this context too. The senior leadership of an organization get to know of the board level about 4% of the challenges a business will face. C-suite, all the people working on the business get to learn about 9% of the challenges. Then it comes down to the people working in the business, the leaders in everyday high-touch contact, get to hear about 50 to 70% of this kind of mental health challenges that the people will experience. Get to experience pretty much 100% of it, right? So the whole idea of that sort of conversation is we can't rely on senior leadership to understand what the challenges in the workplace are. And so if we're going to be in a prevention space, the conversation has to be with everybody. But I sometimes see the sort of B-suite team leaders, supervisors, middle management as like the traffic cops in a sense. They're copping it from on high, but they're seeing it from coming up from below. And so it falls on them a little bit to be adept at dealing with and figuring out what the challenges are and addressing the sort of how we deal with them. And sometimes when we see that the responsibility lies there, they can become a bit overwhelmed, as if I don't have enough to do. I got to be a counselor and a chaplain now on top of everything else. You actually don't. But rather than seeing this as another obligation that we have to deal with, we try and reframe that conversation for leaders to be, this is an opportunity to get closer to your teams, to develop and deepen that sort of rapport and connection with them by being in that sort of service leadership space, looking out for and supporting their mental well-being. And when you've got a leader who's good and adept at that, you've got a team that will follow them wherever they need to go. Every team wants to have a winning leader, and every leader wants to lead a winning team. So when we're mindful of the things that could trip them up or trip us up, it makes for better leadership. It's like the team captain running onto the pitch. I always say that if somebody's limping, you don't have to become a physio and treat the injury, but you need to know what's happening, because you're going to have to change your game plan, or else you're playing a defensive game the whole time. You don't become a counselor or a chaplain. In fact, we emphatically suggest to you that you don't even try.
It's a tough one, having ranged from middle manager up to the C-suite myself. What you say about the challenges that people are facing is so true. We used to try and get out there with the frontline people just to experience life as they experience it.
And they need to know that they can lean into when they have to. That's really important, that they can do that. And so it takes a leader who feels comfortable having the conversation.
Unfortunately, being a manager means having hard conversations. So let's just assume for a sec that you're somebody who is on the, or that people are listening, or is somebody who's on the front line. They're the one who are having to deal face to face with all of the customer issues, problems, and challenges that are coming up on a regular basis. And what does it mean to be able to be resilient in the face of that sort of nonstop onslaught that just never seems to stop?
Again, having that conversation will bring us to the burnout sort of conversation, which is good. I think it's a timely thing to have because it hasn't gone away. And the most recent Gallup research is telling us that we're more disengaged than we've ever been. So a lot of what we've been trying to do just isn't landing yet. There's more stuff going on. So burnout still has to form part of a conversation. And the assumption is that burnout means too much work. I'm overwhelmed, overloaded with work. And in actual fact, what seems to be appearing now is this idea that it's not necessarily too much work, but frustration with what we have to do. And it's amazing, you're nodding your head now as I say that. And I'm finding that with more and more conversations that I'm having. It's not about having too much work. 2 out of 3 of our leaders are experiencing and self-declaring challenges around their overwhelm to levels that are impacting their ability to do their best leadership work. 2 out of 3 say that they are feeling burnt out on some level. And so what's happening for people who are working in the front line, who rely on direction from the leader, they're not getting this sort of leadership that they need. And so they're unclear what's expected of them. And the leader is overwhelmed and therefore short and snapping with them. So nobody's going to go to that leader and say, what do you want from me this week? Or what are my priorities? Because they're afraid of getting their head bitten. If they don't do it, they'll be into a performance conversation. So they try to avoid the conversation altogether with the leader, who doesn't mind because they're already snowed anyway. So that's a sort of very real challenge that people have now. And many of your viewers and listeners will be small businesses. And it's as relevant to them as it is to any larger organization. More so, in fact, because very often in that environment, you're wearing more than one hat. And the lines are blurred around, the lines are blurred between roles within the organization, which makes it even more challenging to know what's expected of me and what I need to be able to do, etc. And then the other challenge, of course, in a small business like that, is sometimes the enmeshment means that the leader or the business owner says, we have beers on a Friday, we have lunch on a Wednesday. My people know that they can talk to me about anything. It's a kind of a red flag to me, because there's an assumption that they will know what to say and talk to you about. But the reality is, if you're that enmeshed, they don't want to let you down, and they don't want to let the rest of the team down. So they tend to say nothing. So as a leader in that environment, you have to have the conversation with them and say, if something's challenging for you, let's have the conversation, and let it be one-on-one. Let it be a gentle inquiry for now. You know what I mean? But create that environment where it's okay to not be okay for a while. And don't assume that people know that, because the ones that do know it are afraid to speak up because they don't want to let you down. And the ones that don't just don't feel safe enough to have it anyway. So you're just going to have to create that space.
And I think that's really relevant, because even for people whose business is a solopreneur business, once you reach a certain stage, you are still going to be outsourcing some of your work to other people. And they're as much of your team, whether they're an employee or somebody who's doing freelance work for you, or you've outsourced it to them on a regular basis. And being able to be clear with them and have those conversations is absolutely critical.
Yes.
So if people are listening and they're going, "Oh,
Yep.
that kind of sounds like me,"
Yeah.
what would be a couple of pieces of advice that you would give to somebody that would help them set the stage for having those kinds of conversations?
Before even the conversation, I would say to your listeners and your clients, what's really important to understand about the new legislation, the new psychosocial hazards legislation, is that you are or will be considered to be a person who controls a business or undertaking. You're a PCBU. And what that means is that you are responsible for the mental well-being of anyone that you employ, you engage to do some work for you, or you cause to engage someone to do some work for you. So you just alluded to it there. These are subcontractors. These are sort of part-time people who come in and do a little bit of work. You're responsible for them when they're doing the work for you in your workplace or in your environment. And as a person who controls a business or undertaking, you don't have to be the employer. You could have a 2IC general manager. They are responsible. And we can't contract our way out of it and say, subcontractors have to have their own sort of legislation, so I leave them worry about that. You have to. Even as a consultant, if I was to come into your business, Trudy, you are responsible for my mental well-being. I have to prove that I have a strategy in place for myself. And I remember when I was completing the paperwork and talking to the auditors and SafeWork, etc., which was as the part of my role anyway, I said to them, "You're asking me if I can dress myself in the morning. This is what I do." And they said, "Yeah, we know you still need a driver's license, even though you're a very good driver, you still need a." And I said, "Yeah, of course, actually, I get that." They're very, very clear now on what's shifted with the legislation. And just heads up to anyone who isn't across it yet, jump on the Safe Work Australia website and have a look and see what's expected of you. Because the days of saying we didn't know have no application anymore. That reasonable mistake of fact does not apply here. The argument now is that you should have known that the work you were asking people to do was going to challenge their mental well-being. So it gets a little bit hairy. But look, don't panic. There's a culture of intention around all of this. And compliance with the legislation, it's only half the story. Actually, what you'll end up getting is performance. If you do this, you actually end up with a better performing team and a better performing business if you're a solopreneur.
Can you share for the people in Australia the name of that legislation again?
If you Google the psychosocial hazards legislation, the psychosocial is a bit of an awkward word. Mental well-being in the workplace is I would have preferred. But basically, when we say psychosocial, what we're talking about is the mental health in the context of the environment in which they find themselves. So mental health in the workplace, the social, cultural, environmental impact. So psychosocial, awkward word, that's what it means. To get really tricky, ISO 45003 is the international standard, which isn't actually cast in stone yet. It's still just a guide, so you can't get audited and accredited in that just yet. Australia jumped on it before anybody else because of our workers' compensation funds going bankrupt and nearly bankrupt on an almost annual basis. So we follow the money. That's where we've gone with it. And It sounds cumbersome and challenging. It isn't when you start to peel it back. There's new legislation. You need a policy. A one-page policy will do. You need a strategy to deliver on your policy. That's just what are we going to do to safeguard our people? And then you need the sort of actionables, and get that to a page or 5 bullet points if you can, all the things that you're going to do around each of the areas like bullying and burnout, etc. Anything that you identify as a challenge in your business. You got that is worth way more than having a big folder, a 30-page document in the bottom of the filing cabinet in case they come through the door. They're not interested. They'll come after someone like that. They're much more interested in someone who's got a tangible, dog-eared, coffee-stained piece of paper that says everyone's reading our strategy and everyone's reading our policy. So don't be overwhelmed by it. Yes, there's a new sheriff in town, but it's not as cumbersome as it actually sounds right now.
That's really interesting. So for our listeners who aren't based in Australia, what you're saying about if you implement these things is going to actually increase your team's performance. It makes a lot of sense to maybe just have a look at the international standard anyway, or even come a look at the Australian one.
Absolutely. The international standard is going to land. It's just that we came out of the starting blocks earlier than anybody else. But it is an ISO. It's an international standard that's coming. 45001 is work health and safety. 45003 is psychological or psychosocial health and safety. So yeah, it's coming. It's here now, but it's coming everywhere else. And so you were saying, what are the things that we can do? I think if we raise awareness that there are challenges in our workplace and that we're serious about tackling and working out how we can support our people, that's enough for everyone in your organization to realize I'm being noticed, I'm being heard, and I'm being cared for. Worth way more than ticking a box and say we've got fruit on a Friday, we're covered. You know what I mean? That's not anymore. People deserve better. They expect more. And it's not a huge impost or cost to give it to them. It's just like any other safety. Everyone gets to go home at the end of the day and come back tomorrow to do it all again. If we can assure that in our business, even our small business, or as a solo, if I can do that, then I'm going to be in a great sort of position to develop what it is I need to do for my people.
Absolutely. I just want to touch base a little bit with something that I mentioned in the introduction. And as I said, I'm looking over your shoulder, I can see what looks like 3 books behind you, but it's the one in the middle that grabbed my attention. Do you want to just tell people a little bit about it?
Up Yours, The Pursuit of Radical Self-Care. So it's about upping their self-care across every domain. And look, shameless plug, is that okay? Butler.com.au is my website, or just apparently you can search, I know it is on Amazon, but you just have to look up Yours, Mark Butler, and apparently it takes you there. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but it seems to work. And look, I wrote this during COVID and developed an entire program for organizations to use. The program is a kind of series of lunch and learn sessions that businesses record, and then the people in the workplace and their families can look at them whenever they like, etc. And basically every chapter in the book is one of those sessions. So when I say radical self-care, what I'm talking about is so much more than sleep, diet, and exercise mindset stuff, although those are hugely important and the bedrock of everything we talk about. But radical self-care means wide-ranging and from the roots, from the ground up. And so we talk about burnout. We talk about how to look out for each other as a team. We talk about resilience, which you mentioned a little while ago. We talk about emotional intelligence and empathy, which all sound like lovely things. There are caveats around those as well. Compassion and empathy we have to be careful with. But we talk about how to work smarter, not harder. Civility in the workplace has come back as a sort of a topic now. Domestic and family violence is now, there's new legislation around that and how the workplace has to support people. So we talk about all of these things. Domestic and family violence isn't in the book, by the way, because the book came out before that legislation did. These are all things that are starting to come up into the conversation now, and it sounds like there's a lot going on. But all of it is designed, it's all manageable and achievable, and it's designed to create a safer and more fulfilling environment. And so my book taps into how to look after ourselves from a much broader sort of perspective. Really valuable for people who run small business.
I think valuable for people who run small valuables, for team leaders,
Mm.
for middle managers, anybody
Yeah.
who's got responsibility for looking after other people and whose own job is reliant on the fact that those people are going to perform, and
Yeah.
at the same time be a bit of a human being and want to care about those people. That's really important. In terms of curious, for anybody who's out there who's listening and going, wow, this guy's written more than one book. What are your other two books? And just talk a little bit about the process of writing those.
Sure. I have contributed to the other two books. The first one is called What the Hell Do We Do Now? And we released that when COVID first happened and the global lockdowns happened. And suddenly we went from something like 7% of the workforce working from home to about 95%, like overnight. And so there was, I think, 18 thought leaders contributed. Okay, what are we going to do? What does this look like? What's the new normal going to be? So I contributed to that, and it was around how are you going to have the caring conversations with your people that you need to have now that there's this thing called Zoom. Has anyone heard of it? And they hadn't. And this is how you're going to be talking to people for a while. How are you going to look after your people who are scared, isolated, lonely, confused, frustrated? How do you have those sorts of conversations with people when you're not face to face anymore? And which was really interesting, because before that, if we had a conversation on the phone or FaceTime with somebody, it was not considered a conversation. Face to face is the only real conversation. That was where our heads were at. Hasn't that changed? Face to face is novelty now. The other book was Peak Performance for Entrepreneurs. And again, I contributed to that, but that is a book that is probably very suitable for your audience. And that, again, is also available on Amazon. Peak Performance, the Mindset Tools for Entrepreneurs. And Eric Severson was the editor of it, and he amassed a bunch of us who were involved in contributing to the book. It's a really good book. And I learned as much from the other people as I hope they learned from me as well. So yeah, very valuable books to have a look at. The process of writing a book. Do you know what? It's interesting. Contributing to a book and someone says, can you write a chapter? Can you give us 20 pages? Can you do something? Now, that's fine. You know what I mean? It's just like a really long newsletter, and I'll talk to you what it is. I'm an expert in that sort of space. So that's okay. Then you go to write your own book. It's a whole other sort of kettle of fish. And really, it's just down to that one's just out, and I'm already on to my next one, which is around this sort of sustainable performance in high pressure, high performing teams. And I was going to call it Up Hours, but if people don't know Up Yours, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So I don't think I can get away with that one. But it would have been nice. Up Them All would have been the third one, which would have been sort of culture in an organization. But the process of writing is really interesting. It's about corralling your ideas. And it's about just the commitment. You have to research, first of all, if you're going to be quoting or referencing anyone. That'll take anybody right back to their sort of college days and APA referencing and all that sort of stuff. I still get hives when I think about it, but it had to be done. But the rest of it is really how you structure the book. And what I do to mine, there's three main parts, and they're colorized. So about look up, look out, and look in are the kind of three main areas around radical self-care. So, you know, what's happening internally, how we connect and relate to other people, and then the sort of stop and smell the roses, look after your sleep and diet, etc. So you have to structure it in a way that makes sense. And then each chapter, I just start each chapter. You can plan it in, and you could be 10 years planning it. Just start writing. If anybody out there is thinking of writing, just start writing, and you can make sense of it then as you go, and cut and paste and copy bits. And here's an insider tip. I don't tell many people. I'd forgotten it, actually. There's a chapter in there on burnout, and it's something like 3,824 words. And I wrote the chapter and I lost it. I could not, still to this day, cannot find it. Don't know what I did with it. So I had to rewrite the chapter. And it came out, the new chapter came out at about 4 words less than the original one. So clearly I had an idea, a map and a plan in my head as to where the chapter would go. And if you look at most books like that in this kind of space, they start with a story, and then they go to the lesson from the story, and then how that applies to the relevance to the book, kind of finishing up with a sort of a question, what can you do around this thing to support yourself? That's a sort of a process. Most books you'll find now are written a bit like that. There's a new one coming up called Stand Up Cultures by Stephen Shedledsky. And Shed was the chief of staff for Simon Sinek. And he sent me his, because he wrote the back for mine, he wrote a testimony for me. So I sent one for him to use on LinkedIn and whatnot. And I was really excited to read his book. He is an expert at writing in that sort of format. And the stories about industry and culture that he writes is really fascinating. He does a superb job in it. And so now you know that's what books should look like and tend to look like. Pick one up, have a reading. I see what they're doing. You'll enjoy it more. Everyone's got a book in them. How many times have we heard that? Just start writing would be my advice.
I think that's great advice. Mark, it's been really great chatting with you about this and just listening to what you're focusing on now and the sorts of things that I think society is generally moving into and towards. Can you just repeat again for us, because I think I talked over the top of you, where people should go if they want to have a look at your new book, the one that's yellow and white?
So you can find it on Amazon, Up Yours, Mark Butler. Its full title is Up Yours, The Pursuit of Radical Self-Care. And we can just show it one more time. Or on my website, if you want it, and I'll sign it for you so that you can't swap it for a kebab on your way home, markbutler.com.au. And in there, you'll find everything else that I do in that kind of team performance and burnout space. I do a lot of coaching for business owners who are struggling through this kind of challenge, etc. So there's plenty of stuff on the website. People can have a kick around and see what sort of stands out to them. Or follow me on LinkedIn. That's another easy one as well.
Thank you for that. So it's mark.butler.com.au.
So www.markbutler.com.au.
All one word, markbutler.com.au. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark.
My absolute pleasure, Trudy. It was lovely to get in touch with you again. And I'd missed it since our last conversation. So I'm really happy that we were able to do this.